If your training only makes sense while you're chasing a goal or anything else, it will not survive when you stop. Most people don't quit training because they're lazy. They quit because the story they were telling themselves finally ran out. The race ended, the program finished, the competition passed, the scale stopped moving, and suddenly there's no reason to train today. That's not a motivation problem. That's a framing problem. Because if training only exists to serve a short-term goal, it becomes optional the moment the goal disappears, and goals always disappear. Your training needs to be a long-term strategy. Your training is a terrible long-term strategy if you only use it to chase outcomes. Outcomes are fleeting. They spike your emotion. They create urgency. They give you something to point at. They also expire. And when they do, most people are left standing in a gym or their garage thinking, well, now what? And that's when training starts feeling pointless. That's when sessions get skipped. That's when identity slowly leaks. Not dramatically, just very quietly. This is where most people misunderstand what training is actually for, though. They think it's for races, PRs, aesthetics, proving something, and those things are useful, but they are not the foundation. They're just bait. Training that survives decades has to be anchored to something deeper than I signed up for another event, because life will eventually make sure you don't get to play that game forever. Here's the long view most people will never take. Your body is not a project. It's a system you live inside. And that system has multiple timelines running at once. Muscles adapting fast, tendons adapting slowly, metabolic health adapting over years, and mental health adapts through repetition and stress exposure. If you only train for what changes quickly, you neglect the things that actually determine how long you stay functional. That's why most people look really fit at 35, but very fragile at 50. They train for outcomes. They didn't train continuity. And this is where mindset actually really starts to matter. Not as hype, not as quotes, not as a believe in yourself wallpaper. Mindset is an operating system that decides whether training continues when it stops being rewarding. And that operating system isn't built on motivation. Motivation is your sugar high. It's useful, it's temporary, unreliable under pressure though. You already know this though. If motivation worked, nobody would quit in February. The mindset that sustains training over decades is built on something much less glamorous. It's called dissonance. The feeling that something is wrong when you don't train. Not out of guilt, not fear, not obsession, just misalignment. Like brushing your teeth once every 3 days and telling yourself it's fine because you're resting your enamel. Sure, technically possible, but also a little unhinged. And this is where people get uncomfortable with what I'm about to say. Because I've trained for decades now, through different sports, goals, injuries, life phases, and on days I don't train, even briefly, something feels off. Not because I'm chasing a goal, not because I'm afraid of losing progress, but because training is how my systems return to baseline. 5 minutes counts, walking counts, carrying counts, mobility counts. The duration is irrelevant. The act matters. Now, some people hear that and immediately reach for a diagnosis. Isn't that unhealthy? Shouldn't you be able to relax? Isn't that just another addiction? No, that's a misunderstanding of what discomfort actually does. Because here's the part that most people avoid because Netflix is easier. Controlled discomfort is the engine of change. Not trauma, not punishment, not grinding yourself into dust. Controlled, chosen, repeatable discomfort. It's how muscles adapt. It's how metabolism improves. How your mental health stabilizes. How identity becomes coherent. Daily discomfort beats daily avoidance every time. And yes, scrolling, binging, and numbing are forms of avoidance. Comfortable ones, socially acceptable ones, still avoided. And this is where training stops being about the gym and starts bleeding into life. When you train consistently, even imperfectly, you rehearse showing up when conditions aren't ideal, adapting plans instead of abandoning them, choosing effort without drama, doing the thing without needing applause. Those skills don't stay in the gym, they show up everywhere else. This is where people who've trained for decades don't talk much about motivation. They talk about rhythm and structure and standards, because motivation is great for starting, but standards are for continuing, and standards are built on repetition, not inspiration. Let's talk about goals for a second, because this always gets twisted. Goals are not bad. They're just not the point. Races, competitions, milestones, they're great, useful pressure. I've got more race bibs than I can count. And they give shape to your training. They add urgency. They create deadlines, but they are scaffolding. You don't live in scaffolding, you use it to build something permanent. When the race ends, the structure must still stand. If it doesn't, the goal was doing all the work, and that's very fragile. And this is where people fall into the world, what's next trap? They finish a big event, immediately need another one. Another race, another challenge, another reason. How many people you know probably finish an ultramarathon and immediately sign up for the next ultramarathon the next day? Or Ironman, or powerlifting competition, or CrossFit competition, whatever it is. If training collapses without an external carrot, the system wasn't internalized yet. That's not a failure, it's just unfinished development you can continue working on. So instead of asking yourself, what am I training for? Ask, who am I becoming by training this way? That question scales across decades because goals change, bodies change, life changes, but the kind of person who trains adapts. Let's talk about health span because this is where the long game really lives. Training is one of those few behaviors that simultaneously improves your metabolic health, joint integrity, cognitive function, emotional regulation, and stress tolerance. You don't get that return from aesthetics alone. You don't get that from PRs alone or events alone. Those are narrow events. Training as a daily practice builds system-wide resilience. That's the difference between looking fit and staying functional. And yeah, this will include your mental health, not in a soft, inspirational way, in a very mechanical way. Movement regulates your neurotransmitter. Effort organizes thought. Physical stress, when dosed correctly, improves emotional stability. Training gives your mind a place to put pressure. Without that outlet, pressure goes somewhere else, usually into anxiety, irritability, or numbness. This is why people feel worse when they stop training, even if life is easier. Ease without structure is destabilizing. The system needs resistance. Now let's address that elephant in the room I know people are starting to think about. Now this does not mean training has to be intense every day. Intensity is optional. Consistency is not. Training through decades means some days are heavy, some days are light, some days are ugly, some days are 5 minutes long. The common thread is not performance and all that, it's continuity. Look, life will punch your training in the face repeatedly, sometimes multiple times a week or even a day. You're going to have injuries, illness, kids, work, loss, aging. If your training only works when life behaves, it's not going to survive very long. The mindset that lasts is not never miss a workout, it's always find a way to move. That's a very different orientation. And this is how training stops being something you do and becomes something you are. Not as ego, not as branding, but as alignment. When you don't train, the day feels incomplete, not because you failed, but because something essential was skipped, like not eating or not sleeping. And yes, that's going to make some people feel uncomfortable. That's fine, because we live in a culture that treats comfort as a virtue and discomfort as pathology. But comfort doesn't build anything. Comfort maintains the status quo. Discomfort changes it. Chosen discomfort, especially physical discomfort, is one of the few honest tools we have left. This is why I'm still training 30 years later. Not because I'm chasing the same goals, I'm not. Not because my body hasn't changed, oh it has, but because the active training keeps my internal systems coherent. It's how I calibrate, it's how I process stress, how I remind myself that effort is still available, even when things are not optimal, especially when things are not optimal. Now there's a quiet irony in all this, because people will worry that training this way is too rigid. In reality, it actually creates flexibility, because when training is part of who you are, not something you negotiate daily, you stop overthinking it. You adapt instead of quitting. You adjust instead of spiraling. You keep going without drama. That's freedom, not rigidity. Okay, let's land this without a prescription. Training that lasts decades is not built on motivation, it's built on identity level alignment. Not the loud kind, the boring kind. The kind where training feels like returning to yourself, not proving yourself. So here's your thought to sit with. When the goals are gone, when the excitement fades, when nobody's watching, does training still make sense? If the answer is no, it's not a flaw. It's just a sign that the deeper mindset hasn't been built yet. And the mindset isn't found, it's cultivated. Daily, quietly, through controlled discomfort. Not because it's impressive, but because training eventually feels wrong, and that's how you stay in the game. Not for a season, not for a race, but for a lifetime.